Every time you have sung "Holy, Holy, Holy" in a church service, you have been singing a word you do not understand. Not because you are careless, not because your pastor failed you, but because the English word holy is a translation of a Hebrew word that does not mean what holy means in English. And the gap between those two meanings is not a small linguistic footnote. It is the difference between a God who demands moral performance and a God who restructures the entire fabric of reality. The Hebrew word is Qadosh. It is used more than 800 times in the Hebrew Bible. It is the root behind holy, saint, sanctify, consecrate, and sanctuary. It is the word that appears 3 times in the seraphim's cry in Isaiah 6. It is the word behind the name of the innermost room of the temple, the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies. It is the word God uses to describe himself, to describe his name, to describe the ground beneath Moses' feet, to describe the nation of Israel, and eventually to describe the Spirit who dwells in every believer. And yet the word is almost never translated correctly. Because the English word holy carries freight the Hebrew word never intended to carry. When a modern reader encounters the word holy, they hear morality, they hear purity, they hear the absence of sin. They hear a standard of ethical behavior so elevated that only God meets it fully and only the exceptionally devout approximate it. They hear a quality of character, a description of inner virtue, a state of moral cleanliness. And that meaning is not wrong, exactly. But it is not primary. It is not what the word means when it first appears in the text. And when you start at the wrong definition, every subsequent passage that uses the word is subtly misread. The entire theology built on the word is quietly tilted in the wrong direction. And after 2,000 years of that tilt, the church has ended up with a version of holiness that is more Greek than Hebrew, more ethical than relational, more exhausting than transforming. If this channel has helped you see the Hebrew text differently, subscribe and drop your country in the comments. We have people working through these word studies from Pakistan to Brazil to South Korea, and knowing you are here matters more than you might think. The Hebrew root of Qadosh is the 3-letter root QDSH, which appears in various forms throughout the ancient Semitic languages. The earliest and most foundational meaning of that root is not purity. It is not morality. It is not virtue. The earliest meaning is separation, distinctness, set-apartness from the ordinary. The basic idea encoded in the root is the idea of something that has been taken out of the common order of things and placed in a category of its own. Something that does not belong to the regular world. Something that operates according to a different logic than everything else around it. This is why the first time the word appears in the Hebrew Bible, it is not applied to a person. It is not applied to God's character. It is applied to a day. Genesis 2:3. And God blessed the 7th day and made it holy. The Hebrew is vayikadesh oto. He kadeshed it. He set it apart. He separated it from the 6 days that preceded it. The Sabbath is not holy because it is morally superior to Tuesday. It is holy because God removed it from the ordinary flow of time and designated it as belonging to a different category entirely. It is not common time. It is not regular time. It is time that has been extracted from the ordinary and marked as belonging specifically to God. That is the architecture of the word. That is the foundational logic that every subsequent use builds on. And once you see it in Genesis 2, you cannot unsee it. The word does not primarily ask the question, how virtuous is this thing? It asks the question, does this thing belong to the common world, or has it been claimed by something beyond the common world? The distinction has a name in the Hebrew worldview. The two categories are Kodesh and Kal, holy and common, sacred and profane. The word profane is not negative in the original sense. Chal simply means ordinary, belonging to the regular world, available for common use. And Qadosh is the opposite, not ordinary, not available for common use, belonging to a different sphere, claimed by God, removed from the realm of the unremarkable. This is why the Sabbath candles are lit and a blessing is spoken at the moment the Sabbath begins. The Hebrew community understood that time itself had two registers, common time and sacred time, and the boundary between them was not gradual. It was a threshold. You crossed it. You entered Qadosh. You left call behind. That threshold logic runs through the entire Hebrew Bible. It runs through the architecture of the tabernacle and the temple. The outer court was accessible to the people, the inner court to the priests, the Holy of Holies to the high priest alone, once a year. Each boundary was not a fence keeping sinners out. It was a marker of increasing Qadosh, an increasing degree of separation from the ordinary. The architecture was not built to communicate moral hierarchy. It was built to communicate ontological distance, the difference between the common and the claimed, between the world as it runs on its own and the space where God has placed His name. There is a moment in the book of Exodus that illustrates this more vividly than any theological argument can. Moses is in the wilderness, tending sheep on the far side of the desert, when he sees a bush that is burning but is not consumed. He turns aside to look at it. And before he can get close, before he can examine the phenomenon, before he can form a rational explanation, a voice speaks from the fire. Exodus 3:5. Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Notice what has made the ground holy. Not Moses' behavior, not the moral quality of the soil. The ground is Qadosh because God's presence has landed on it. The presence of God is what creates the category of the holy. The ground was ordinary desert before the burning bush. It had no special moral quality. It had no prior religious significance. Camels had walked on it. Sheep had grazed on it. The wind had swept across it for centuries without incident. And then the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob descended to that spot, and the ordinary became extraordinary, not because it changed, but because it was claimed. The sandals come off not as a ritual of purification, but as an acknowledgement of threshold crossing. Moses is entering a different register of reality. He is leaving the common world and stepping into the space where the holy God has placed himself. And the sandals that are appropriate for call, for ordinary ground, for common travel, are not appropriate for Qadosh. Not because sandals are sinful, but because the register has changed. The same logic that separates Sabbath from Tuesday separates this patch of Sinai desert from every other patch of Sinai desert. The presence of God is what makes the difference. This is the theological center of Qadosh. Holiness is not a quality that God possesses the way a moral philosopher might possess virtue. Holiness is the description of what God is in relation to everything else that exists. He is categorically, fundamentally, irreducibly other. He does not belong to the same category as creation. He is not an advanced version of what we are. He is not the highest point on a spectrum that runs from worst to best. He is outside the spectrum entirely. He is Qadosh, set apart from the totality of the created order by his very nature. This is what the seraphim are declaring in Isaiah 6. The vision is one of the most dramatic scenes in the entire Hebrew Bible. Isaiah is in the temple. The year that King Uzziah died, the text tells us, so approximately 740 BC. And he sees the Lord seated on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe fills the temple. Around him are the seraphim, 6-winged creatures, covering their faces, covering their feet, crying out to one another in a call and response that shakes the doorposts. Qadosh, Qadosh, Qadosh Adonai Tzvaot. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The threefold repetition is not accidental, and it is not merely poetic emphasis. In Hebrew, repetition carries weight. To say a word twice is emphasis. To say it 3 times is to declare it in its absolute, ultimate, superlative degree. The seraphim are not saying God is fairly holy. They are not saying God is the holiest being they have encountered so far. They are declaring that holiness, the radical separateness from the ordinary, the irreducible otherness, belongs to God in its fullest and most absolute form. He is the definition from which everything else borrows. And the effect on Isaiah is not inspiration. It is not a warm devotional feeling. It is devastation. "Woe to me," Isaiah cries. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." The encounter with Qadosh does not make Isaiah feel elevated. It makes him feel exposed, not because God lectures him about his moral failures, but because the otherness of God makes visible by contrast what Isaiah is, what every human being is, not primarily sinful in the sense of having broken a list of rules, but finite, creaturely, chal, common, belonging to the ordinary world. And the ordinary world cannot stand before the absolute Qadosh without the contrast becoming unbearable. But here is where the story of Qadosh becomes remarkable, and it is the turn that most English readers never make, because the translation has already shut the door before they arrive at it. The holiness of God in the Hebrew Bible is not primarily a barrier, it is primarily a force, and the direction of that force is outward, toward the world, toward the people, toward the ordinary. The God who is Qadosh does not remain contained in the Holy of Holies. He does not sit at the center of the concentric rings of the temple and wait for worthy worshipers to inch their way toward him. The movement in the Hebrew Bible is consistently from the holy toward the common, from God toward the world, from the center outward. This is what the concept of consecration is about. Hekdesh, dedicating something to God, is the act of taking something that was kal and moving it into the category of kodesh, not by purifying it in the moral sense, by transferring its ownership, by marking it as belonging to a different sphere. The firstborn sons of Israel are holy, not because they are morally superior to their younger brothers. They are holy because God claimed them. He said, "These belong to me." The Levites who replaced them in temple service are holy, not because they are better people than the other tribes. They are holy because God separated them for his use. The nation of Israel itself is called a Goy Qadosh, a holy nation, in Exodus 19:6, a kingdom of priests. And again, the word does not primarily make a moral claim. It makes a covenantal claim. Israel is not holy because the Israelites are more virtuous than the Egyptians or the Canaanites. Israel is holy because God chose them, separated them, marked them as belonging to himself in a way that no other nation was marked. The holiness is relational before it is ethical. The ethical requirements that follow from it, the laws of Leviticus, the commands of Deuteronomy, are not the basis of the holiness. They are the appropriate response to a holiness that already exists on the basis of God's choice. This is the moment in the argument where the entire theology of Leviticus begins to make a different kind of sense. The dietary laws, the purity regulations, the laws about mixing fabrics and not planting 2 kinds of seed in the same field. Modern readers look at these commands and see arbitrary rules designed to test obedience. But that reading misses the point entirely. What Leviticus is doing is encoding the logic of Qadosh into the daily life of the community. Every distinction between clean animals and unclean animals, between the Sabbath and the other days, between the priest and the ordinary Israelite, is a lived, embodied practice of the fundamental Hebrew idea that reality has 2 registers, the common and the holy, the ordinary and the claimed. And the people who belong to the Qadosh God are to live in a way that makes that distinction visible, not to earn their holiness, to inhabit it, Leviticus 11:44. For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. The Hebrew is viheitem kadoshim ki kadosh ani. You be kadoshim because I am kadosh. The command to holiness in Leviticus is not a command to achieve moral perfection. It is a command to live in a way that matches what is already true. God has claimed this people. They are already Kodesh by virtue of the covenant. The command is to live from that reality, not toward it. The depth of what is happening with Qadosh only becomes visible when you trace the word into the most unexpected places in the Hebrew Bible, because the same word that describes God's radical otherness is used for things that are emphatically not morally pure. And those uses break open the English translation in ways that cannot be recovered without going back to the Hebrew. The Nazirite vow in Numbers 6 is one of the most striking examples. A Nazirite was a person who made a specific vow to God: no wine, no cutting of hair, no contact with a dead body, even the body of a close family member, for a set period of time. The text says that during the period of the vow, the Nazirite is kadosh to the Lord, holy to the Lord. And what is the external marker of that holiness? Long hair. The very thing that in other contexts can simply be a fashion choice or a cultural norm is transformed by the context of the vow into a sign of Qadosh. The hair does not have moral value in itself. It has covenantal value. It is the visible marker that this person has been removed from the ordinary and claimed for a specific period of dedicated service. The oil used to anoint the tabernacle and its furnishings is called Shemin Mishchat Kodesh, holy anointing oil. The incense burned before the Lord is Ketoret Kodesh, holy incense. These are not morally virtuous oils and incenses. They are ordinary substances that have been extracted from common use and reserved exclusively for the purpose of marking the presence of the holy God. They are Qadosh not because of what they are, but because of what they have been designated for, what they have been set apart to. Even the word for prostitute in certain ancient texts is related to the same root, the Kedeshah, a woman associated with certain ancient Near Eastern shrine practices, is called by a word built on QDSH, not because her activity is holy in the moral sense, but because she was, in those contexts, understood to be set apart for a sacred function. The word Qadosh marks the set-apartness without making a prior judgment about the moral quality of what the thing is set apart for. The moral evaluation comes separately. The linguistic root simply encodes the category distinction. This has been removed from the ordinary. This is not to create confusion. It is to show the raw semantic architecture of the word before the ethics are layered on. The ethics matter enormously, but they are not the foundation. The foundation is the ontological category. The sacred versus the common. The claimed versus the unclaimed. And when you see that clearly, you can understand why the holiness of God, His Qadosh nature, is the most fundamental thing the Hebrew Bible says about Him. Not His love, not His power, not His wisdom. Those qualities describe what He does. Qadosh describes what He is in relation to everything else that exists. He is the one who belongs to no category but His own. Now the trajectory toward the New Testament begins to open, and it opens along a path that most believers have never been shown. The prophet Isaiah uses Qadosh in a way that is distinct from everything that came before it. He gives God a title that appears nowhere in the earlier Hebrew writings with the same force or frequency. He calls God Qadosh Yisrael, the Holy One of Israel. It appears 25 times in Isaiah and rarely elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. And the title is doing something specific. It is binding together the absolute otherness of God and His committed nearness to Israel into a single compound identity. He is not simply Qadosh, the abstract, unapproachable absolute. He is Qadosh Yisrael, the radically other God who has chosen Israel as the specific address of His presence in the world. And in 2nd Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55, the great poetry of the exile. The Holy One of Israel keeps appearing, but now in contexts of comfort and rescue rather than judgment. Isaiah 41:14. Do not fear, you worm Jacob, you little Israel. I am the one who helps you, declares the Lord. Your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. The Holy One of Israel is the Redeemer. The utterly other God is the one drawing near. The logic has not reversed. The Qadosh has not been softened. What has happened is that the God whose holiness makes Isaiah cry, I am ruined, is the same God who sends a seraph to touch Isaiah's lips with a coal from the altar and say, your guilt is taken away and your sin is atoned for. The holiness does not consume. The holiness cleanses. And it cleanses not by raising the worshiper to God's level, but by the Qadosh, God himself, closing the distance from his side. This is the movement that the New Testament brings to its most concentrated expression. And the word at the center of it is hagios, the Greek translation of Qadosh. When Jesus, in John 17, prays for his disciples, he says, sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. The Greek verb is hagiason, make them hagios, make them kadosh, set them apart. Remove them from the category of the merely common and mark them as belonging to a different register of reality entirely, not by making them morally perfect, by claiming them, by the act of God's own designation reaching out and placing them in a new category. The same movement from the common to the holy that happened on ordinary ground in Sinai desert when the burning bush appeared. Except now the ground is a human life. And the fire is not a bush. It is the Spirit of the God who is Qadosh, Qadosh, Qadosh. Paul picks up this logic in his letters with a precision that the English translation consistently flattens. When he writes to the churches and addresses them as the saints, the Greek word is hagioi, the Qadosh ones, the holy ones. And he is not calling them the morally excellent ones. He is not congratulating them on achieving a standard. He is identifying what they are by virtue of what God has done. The Corinthian church, to take the most striking example, is called hagioi in 1 Corinthians 1:2. And then immediately thereafter, Paul spends 15 chapters addressing their division, their sexual immorality, their lawsuits against each other, their chaos in worship. The holiness is not the conclusion of their moral achievement. It is the premise from which the ethical instruction flows. You are Qadosh. Therefore, live accordingly. This is the precise inversion of how most believers understand the relationship between holiness and behavior. The popular understanding runs, behave well enough and God will consider you holy. The Hebrew understanding, carried fully into the New Testament, runs, God has already claimed you as his own and placed you in the category of the Qadosh. Now live from that reality. The direction of the arrow changes everything. Everything. And there is one more layer. It is the layer that brings the whole architecture of Qadosh down to the ground of daily experience and makes it more practically demanding than any mere moral code ever could. The Levitical command, be holy, for I am holy, is quoted directly by Peter in his first letter. 1 Peter 1:15-1:6. As he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. The word conduct in Greek is anastrophe. Your manner of life, the texture of how you move through the world, every interaction, every decision, every relationship. And the standard Peter sets is not a list. It is a person, as he who called you is holy. The standard for the people of the Qadosh God is not a code of rules that can be checked off. It is a participation in the nature of the one who claimed them. To be Qadosh in the full Hebrew sense is to live in such a way that your life is visibly marked as belonging to a different register of reality than the common world around you. Not morally superior in a way that produces pride. Distinctly claimed in a way that produces freedom. Freedom from the logic of the common world. Freedom from the assumption that the ordinary categories, power, status, wealth, self-preservation are the final categories. The Qadosh person lives as a walking sign that there is a different order of things, that the world as it runs on its own terms is not the last word, that the God who is categorically other has placed his name on this life and separated it for his own purposes. The early church community was called hagios by the world around them, but in a different tone. The Roman and Greek world looked at these people who refused to sacrifice to the imperial gods, who shared their wealth with strangers, who treated slaves and free people as brothers, who did not expose their unwanted infants, and the world's word for them was separated ones, different ones, not like us. And the church accepted the label, because the label was the point. They were supposed to look different, not because they were morally superior to their neighbors, because they had been claimed by the one who is Qadosh, 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 and you do not live the same way after that. The heaviest thing that Qadosh produces is not a demand. It is a discovery. The discovery that the God who is most absolutely, most utterly, most completely other than everything in the created order, is also the God who moves toward the world with the force of the burning bush, who descends to ordinary ground and makes it holy by his presence, who reaches into common humanity and says, "This one belongs to me," who takes 12 ordinary fishermen and tax collectors and social outcasts and places them in the category of hagioi, the set-apart ones, the claimed ones, the owned. The holiness of God is not the fence that keeps you out. It is the fire that has already come to you. And the question Qadosh asks is not whether you are good enough. It never was. The question is whether you understand what has already happened, whether you know what category you are in, whether you are living from the reality of being claimed by the one who burns with an uncreated fire and yet does not consume the bush, does not destroy the prophet, does not abandon the exile, does not leave the sinner outside. The seraphim cry, Qadosh, 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 not because they are warning you away. They are declaring what makes the whole story possible. The God who is in a category entirely his own is the God who chose to make that category permeable, who carved a door in the wall between the holy and the common and walked through it, first into a burning bush, then into a tabernacle, then into a temple, then into flesh. That is not a God who is asking you to achieve holiness. That is a God who has come to give it. If today was the first time you have heard Qadosh explained this way, if the word has opened up into something larger than you expected, share this with someone who needs to hear it. We are building a library of these studies, one word at a time, because the Hebrew text is not finished surprising us. Subscribe and stay in the conversation. God bless you.